He was arrested by American soldiers and thrown into an internment camp on suspicion of working for Hitler's secret police. The testimony that helped keep him locked up came from his own brother. By the time he walked free, his family's company, his hometown, and his own name had been turned against him. You would think a man betrayed like that, humiliated like that, stripped of everything he'd spent 30 years building, would simply disappear into history as a footnote. Well, Rudolf Dassler didn't disappear. He built Puma, a shoe company that would go on to dress Olympic champions, arm the fastest man alive, and pull off one of the most audacious marketing stunts in sports history, live in front of 1 billion television viewers. He did it from a single building on the wrong side of a river, in the same small German town where his own brother was building the company that would become Adidas. So how does a man labeled a Nazi collaborator, locked out of his own family's business, and abandoned by nearly everyone he trusted, build a global sportswear empire that still bears his fingerprints today? To find out, we have to go back to Herzogenaurach, Germany, and a house that smelled like clean laundry and fresh leather. Now, before we go further, I want to clear something up, because you may have heard this story told a certain way. Rudolf Dassler was not an orphan. His parents, Christoph and Paulina Dassler, were alive throughout his childhood and well into his adult life. What he actually grew up with was poverty, hard labor, and a family that clawed its way up from nothing. That's a different story than an orphan story. But honestly, I'd argue it's a better one, because everything that happened to Rudolf Dassler happened within a family. And that's exactly what makes it so devastating. Rudolf was born on March 26, 1898, in Herzogenaurach, a small town in Bavaria that most of the world had never heard of and, frankly, had no reason to. His father, Christoph, worked long shifts in a local shoe factory, coming home every night with leather dust in his lungs and barely enough money to keep the family fed. His mother, Paulina, ran a laundry business out of the house, scrubbing other people's clothes by hand to bring in extra income. There were 4 Dassler children. Rudolf was the oldest. Then came his sister Marie, his brother Fritz, and finally, in 1900, his younger brother Adolf, whom everyone called Adi. You see, this wasn't a household with spare time or spare money. It was a household built entirely around work. And from a young age, Rudolf understood something his quieter, more introverted younger brother never quite grasped instinctively, that a product doesn't sell itself. Someone has to sell it. That difference between the two brothers would define the rest of both of their lives. And it showed up early. As teenagers, Rudolf was the one who'd walk into the local sporting clubs and cobbler shops around Herzogenaurach, striking up conversations with anyone who'd listen, while Adi stayed home experimenting with leather scraps and rubber soles late into the night. Their mother's laundry room, with its low ceiling and constant smell of soap and starch, became the unlikely birthplace of an entire industry. Customers would come by the house to pick up clean shirts and leave with a pair of hand-stitched athletic shoes tucked under their arm. A little side hustle that Rudolf, even as a young man, instinctively understood had far more potential than laundry ever would. Rudolf grew into an outgoing, forceful, ambitious young man. He loved being in a room full of people. He loved talking, negotiating, persuading. Adi, on the other hand, was quiet, mechanical, obsessive about craft. He'd rather be alone in a workshop, taking a shoe apart and putting it back together than standing in front of a crowd. Neighbors in Herzogenaurach used to say you could always tell which Dassler brother you were talking to within about 10 seconds. One would charm you. The other would barely make eye contact, but could tell you exactly why your shoe was falling apart at the seam. Both brothers fought in the First World War. Rudolf came home in 1918 changed, like millions of young German men were, by 4 years of a war that had shattered the country's economy and its confidence. Germany was broke, jobs were scarce, and in that wreckage, sitting in his mother's laundry room in Herzogenaurach, Adi Dassler started experimenting with something almost nobody in Germany at the time thought was worth doing: making shoes specifically built for athletes. Rudolf watched his brother tinkering with leather and rubber and spikes, and he saw something Adi didn't quite see in himself. He saw a business. Rudolf had the salesmanship, the confidence, the hunger for scale. Adi had the obsession with the product. And in 1924, the two brothers formalized what they'd already been building together, registering a company called Gebrüder Dassler Schuhfabrik, the Dassler brothers' shoe factory. It was a tiny operation at first, a dozen workers in a converted washroom, generating their own electricity because the town's supply was too unreliable, turning out about 50 pairs of shoes a day. Adi built them, Rudolf sold them, and for a while, it worked beautifully. By the 1930s, the brothers had achieved something remarkable for two men from a town most maps didn't bother labeling. Their track spikes were on the feet of world-class athletes. At the 1936 Berlin Olympics, an American sprinter named Jesse Owens wore Dassler spikes to 4 gold medals right in front of Adolf Hitler, in a moment that would go down as one of the great humiliations of Nazi propaganda. Rudolf, ever the salesman, had personally helped make sure Owens laced up in their shoes. Business was good, really good. But you see, there was a storm coming that had nothing to do with shoes, and it would tear this family apart in a way no business rivalry ever could. By this point, Rudolf could have reasonably believed the two brothers had built something untouchable, a family company run by two men with complementary talents, supplying some of the greatest athletes on the planet in a country that was rapidly industrializing around them. It must have felt, for a brief window in the mid-1930s, like the Dassler name was destined to become one of the great success stories of German industry. And in a way, it was. Just not in the way either brother could have predicted, and not as one company. Both Rudolf and Adi Dassler joined the Nazi Party in May of 1933, just months after Hitler took power. It wasn't unusual at the time. Millions of ordinary Germans joined for reasons ranging from genuine belief to simple professional survival. But of the two brothers, it was Rudolf who was described by those who knew him as the more ardent true believer. This detail matters, because it would come back to haunt him in ways he could never have predicted. When the war broke out, the Gebrüder Dassler factory did what factories across Germany were forced to do. It stopped making running shoes and started making military boots. By 1944, with the war going badly for Germany, the factory had shifted again, this time to manufacturing Panzerschreck anti-tank weapons under Wehrmacht contract. In 1941, Rudolf himself had volunteered for the Wehrmacht and been sent to the Eastern Front, one of the deadliest theaters in human history, before injuries got him reassigned. Here's where things get dark, really dark. In July of 1945, just weeks after American troops rolled into Herzogenaurach, Rudolf Dassler was arrested. The suspicion was that he had worked for the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, the intelligence and counter-espionage wing of the SS. He was hauled off to an internment camp in Hammelburg, and he would sit there for over a year while investigators tried to determine exactly what he had done during the war. And here's the part of the story that I think you need to really sit with for a second. While Rudolf was locked away, his own brother Adi and Adi's wife Kaite gave testimony that pointed toward Rudolf's SS involvement. Whether it was self-preservation, old grudges, or genuine belief that Rudolf had done something wrong, we may never fully know. But the effect was the same. Rudolf sat in that camp for over a year, in part because of statements made by his own family. Picture that for a moment. A man who had spent his whole life as the confident one, the extrovert, the salesman who could charm a room full of strangers, now sitting inside an internment camp with no idea when or if he would ever get out. While back home, his own brother ran the business the two of them had built side by side since they were young men. He was finally released on July 31st, 1946, after investigators concluded there simply was not enough evidence to prove he had done what he was accused of. He walked out of Hammelburg a free man, but he was not the same man who walked in, and he was certainly not going back to business as usual with his brother, because almost immediately, the tables turned. Later that same year, a denazification panel classified Adi the Belastete, meaning incriminated, a serious label that threatened to remove him from leadership of the family company entirely and potentially send him to prison. Rudolf saw an opening. He testified that Adi had been the true mastermind behind the factory's weapons production during the war, hoping to finally push his brother out and take sole control of the business they had spent over 2 decades building together. The panel did not buy it. Adi was cleared. He walked right back into control of the company. Can you imagine sitting across a table from your own brother, each of you having just tried to sink the other, both of you knowing there was no coming back from this? That is exactly where Rudolf and Adi Dassler found themselves in 1946 and 1947. Two brothers who had built something extraordinary out of nothing, now circling each other like strangers, each one certain the other had tried to destroy him. There were other wounds too, smaller ones that piled on top of the war and the betrayals. Rudolf's wife and Adi's wife despised each other, and the two families were forced to live in the same villa above the factory, trading icy silences across the same dinner table night after night. By 1948, the marriage that was Gebrüder Dassler, 30 years of shared blood, shared sweat, and a shoe factory built from a washroom, was over. The brothers shut the company down entirely, and Rudolf Dassler walked away from everything he had spent 3 decades building, with nothing but his name and his instincts. In January of 1948, Rudolf registered a new company. He called it Schuhfabrik Rudolf Dassler, but he gave it a shorter, punchier working name, one built from his own name, Ruda. Ru from Rudolf, Da from Dassler. Operations began on June 1st, 1948, with just 14 employees in a small facility on the southern side of the river Aurach that splits Herzogenaurach in two. 14 employees. That's what was left of an operation that had once outfitted Olympic champions. But Rudolf wasn't going to sit around feeling sorry for himself. He had spent his entire adult life selling things, and now, for the first time, he had a company that was entirely his own to sell. Those first couple of years were brutal. Rudolf had the name, the drive, and a handful of loyal workers who had followed him out of Gebrüder Dassler. What he didn't have was capital, distribution, or, frankly, much of a reputation independent of the family name he now shared with a bitter rival. Money was tight enough that early production runs were small. Deliveries were done however Rudolf could manage them, and more than a few nights were spent wondering whether this whole gamble had been a colossal mistake. But Rudolf kept doing the one thing he'd always done best. He kept selling. He kept showing up at football clubs, at athletic meets, anywhere a coach or an athlete might be persuaded to try on a pair of his shoes instead of his brother's. By October of that same year, he'd landed on a new name for the brand, one that would end up meaning far more to him than a marketing decision. He named it Puma. And here's a detail I love. Back in his university days, friends had nicknamed young Rudolf Puma himself because of his speed and his agility. He was, quite literally, naming the company after the nickname people had once given him. The Wildcat represented everything Rudolf believed a shoe brand should be: fast, elegant, dangerous when it needed to be. In December of 1948, the name became official: Puma Schuhfabrik Rudolf Dassler. A year later, in August of 1949, his brother Adi launched his own company just across town, combining his first and last name into a new word the world would come to know very, very well: Adidas. The river Aurach now physically separated the two brothers' companies, and the town of Herzogenaurach split right along with them. Almost the entire population went to work for one brother or the other. Families that had been friends for generations suddenly weren't speaking. People started checking each other's shoes on the street before deciding whether it was safe to say hello, earning the town its infamous nickname, the town of bent necks. For nearly the rest of their lives, Rudolf and Adi Dassler would live and work less than a mile apart and never speak to each other again. School teachers reportedly learned which children came from which side of the river before deciding how to seat a classroom. Local butchers and bakers found themselves quietly choosing sides, since serving the wrong family's employees too warmly could cost them customers on the other side of town. It sounds almost unbelievable today, a single feud between two brothers reshaping the social fabric of an entire town for generations. But that's exactly what happened in Herzogenaurach. And at the center of it, walking to work every morning past a factory his own brother now controlled, was Rudolf, building something new out of what was left. Now, if this were simply a story about a bitter family feud, it would still be remarkable. But what happened next is the part that I think gets overlooked, because everyone remembers the feud, and almost nobody remembers what Rudolf actually built with what was left to him. Because Puma, starting from 14 employees and a converted building on the wrong side of a river, was about to become one of the most important sportswear companies on Earth. Rudolf understood something that would define Puma's entire strategy for the next quarter century. If he couldn't outcraft his brother, he could outmarket him. Adi had always been the perfectionist, the one obsessed with the shoe itself. Rudolf had always been the one obsessed with getting that shoe onto the right foot, in front of the right cameras, at the right moment. In 1950, Puma released its first football boot, the Atom, and it caught on quickly among German players. 2 years later, working with West Germany's own national team coach, Sepp Herber, Rudolf's engineers unveiled the Super Atom, widely considered the world's first football boot with screw-in studs, a genuine innovation that let players adjust their footing based on field conditions. It wasn't just a shoe. It was a statement that Puma could out-innovate the very brother who had always considered himself the technical genius of the family. Then came the moment that put Puma on the world stage in a completely different way. In 1954, sprinter Heinz Futterer tied the world record in the 100 meters at 10.2 seconds, wearing a pair of Puma running shoes. Suddenly, a company that had started with 14 employees in a shed had its name attached to the fastest human being on the planet. But by this point, I think you know Rudolf wasn't going to stop there. In 1958, Puma introduced what would become one of the most recognizable design elements in sportswear history, the form strip. Originally engineered simply to help stabilize the foot inside the shoe, the curved side stripe would evolve into Puma's signature visual mark, instantly recognizable on shelves next to the 3 stripes his brother was building just across town. By 1959, Rudolf restructured the business, bringing his wife and his 2 sons, Armin and Gerd, in as part owners. This wasn't just a shoe company anymore. It was becoming a family institution in its own right, an entirely separate dynasty rising from the ashes of the one that had collapsed a decade earlier. However, Rudolf's most aggressive instincts as a salesman were about to create controversy that would follow him for years. At the 1960 Rome Olympics, German sprinter Armin Hari won gold in the 100 meters. What happened next became one of the most talked about scandals in the early history of sports sponsorship. Reports emerged that Hari had been paid by Rudolf's company to wear Puma shoes in the race itself, one of the very first documented cases of an Olympic athlete receiving direct payment for an endorsement. Some accounts even suggest Hari switched shoes mid-competition depending on which company was paying more that particular day. It was murky, it was controversial, and it revealed exactly how far Rudolf Dassler was willing to push the boundaries of amateur sports to get his name onto a winner's foot. And that Olympic scandal in 1960 didn't slow him down for even a moment. If anything, it seemed to confirm exactly what Rudolf already believed about the sports world, that everyone had a price. And the only real question was, who was willing to pay it first? You see, Rudolf didn't just want good shoes. He wanted good stories. He understood, decades before most of the advertising industry caught on, that a shoe on the right foot at the right moment was worth more than any advertisement money could buy. By 1962, Puma shoes were being exported to nearly 100 countries. A brand that started with 14 employees on the wrong side of a small Bavarian river was now genuinely global. Factories expanded, new product lines rolled out beyond football and track into training shoes and casual footwear. And Rudolf's small, spiteful startup had quietly become a serious threat to the very brother who once believed he'd left Rudolf with nothing worth salvaging. And Rudolf was just getting started. Throughout the 1960s, Puma poured resources into signing the era's biggest emerging talent in the sport that mattered more than any other in the world, football. And the biggest talent of all was a young Brazilian named Edson Arantes do Nascimento. You know him as Pelé. Both Puma and Adidas wanted him badly. So badly, in fact, that the two rival companies reportedly reached an informal understanding, sometimes called the Pelé Pact, an agreement that neither company would sign him, out of fear that a bidding war would bankrupt them both, chasing the same athlete. For a while, that gentleman's agreement held, but Rudolf Dassler was not a man who honored gentlemen's agreements when there was an opportunity sitting right in front of him. Ahead of the 1970 World Cup in Mexico, Puma representatives quietly worked out an arrangement with Pelé that technically sidestepped the pact entirely. Rather than an official team sponsorship, Puma reportedly agreed to pay Pelé something in the neighborhood of $120,000, an enormous sum at the time, for one specific, seemingly small favor. Just before kickoff of Brazil's quarter-final match, Pelé would pause, kneel down in full view of every camera in the stadium, and calmly tie his Puma boots. June 14, 1970, Brazil versus Peru. The whole world was watching, and right as the match was about to begin, Pelé stopped, dropped to one knee, and tied his laces. Every single broadcast camera in that stadium found him in that moment. It was elegant, it was unhurried, and it put the Puma logo on television screens in living rooms across the entire planet, all without technically violating a single word of the agreement with Adidas. Announcers on television broadcasts around the world found themselves almost helplessly narrating the moment in real time, which of course only drew more attention to exactly what Rudolf had planned all along. The moment became one of the most famous pieces of sports marketing in history. Puma's sales reportedly jumped by roughly 300% in the aftermath, and the company posted one of the strongest financial years in its history. Adidas executives were reportedly furious, but there was nothing they could do. Rudolf had found the loophole, and he'd walked right through it in front of 1 billion witnesses. This is the part of the story where I think Rudolf Dassler's whole philosophy finally comes into focus. He never had the patience or the obsessive craftsmanship of his younger brother. What he had instead was an instinct for spectacle, for timing, for putting a product in exactly the right moment for the whole world to notice. It's the same instinct that made him effective as a young salesman decades earlier in his father's tiny shoe operation, and it never left him. By the early 1970s, Puma had transformed from a wounded, betrayed man's act of pure spite into a legitimate global institution employing thousands of people and selling shoes on every continent. Rudolf had done it without his brother, without his family's original company, and without ever speaking to Adi again. And Puma was not just chasing football and track anymore. By the early 1970s, the company was pushing into an entirely new American market, basketball. Puma signed New York Knicks guard Walt Clyde Frazier, building him a low-cut suede sneaker that would eventually be released to the public as the Puma Clyde, one of the first signature basketball shoes ever sold to everyday consumers. It's a piece of footwear history that still echoes through sneaker culture today, decades after Rudolf's death, every time someone laces up a pair of low-top suede trainers without knowing exactly where the idea came from. However, time was running out for Rudolf to enjoy what he'd built. On October 27, 1974, Rudolf Dassler died of lung cancer. He was 76 years old. He had spent the final chapter of his life estranged from the brother he'd built an empire with, running a rival company less than a mile from where that first empire had started, in the same small town where they'd both grown up scrubbing laundry stains and stitching leather in their mother's kitchen. His son Armin took over as chief executive, and it was under Armin's leadership that Puma would truly become the massive worldwide brand we recognize today, expanding far beyond the shoes Rudolf had spent his life obsessing on over. Rudolf's other son, Gerd, remained involved in the business as well, quietly, without the public drama that had defined his father's generation. And when you step back and look at the paradox of Rudolf Dassler's life, it really is remarkable. This was a man labeled a Nazi collaborator by American occupying forces, a man locked in an internment camp for over a year, in part because of testimony from his own brother. A man who tried and failed to have that same brother stripped of their shared company, and who lost everything as a result. By any reasonable measure, Rudolf Dassler should have been the Dassler brother that history forgot. Instead, he built one of the most recognizable sportswear brands on the planet, virtually from scratch, using nothing but 14 employees, a name people had once given him as a joke about his speed, and an unmatched instinct for spectacle. Think about how many people, in that exact position, betrayed by the person closest to them and publicly humiliated on top of it, would have simply quit. Taken a quiet job somewhere, changed their name, disappeared from public life entirely. Rudolf did the opposite. He rebuilt in full view of the very brother who had wronged him, close enough that the two of them could have shouted across the river and been heard. Rudolf never got the credit for craftsmanship that his brother did. He was never remembered as the technical genius, but he understood something that mattered just as much in business as good engineering. The story around a product is sometimes just as powerful as the product itself. A pair of laces tied in front of 1 billion people, a world record broken in his shoes, a logo based on his own old nickname chasing his brother's stripes across a river that literally cut their hometown in two. Now, Puma's story did not stay smooth after Rudolf's death, and I think it's worth mentioning. because it shows just how fragile even a global brand can be once its founder is gone. Through the 1980s and into the early 1990s, Puma actually stumbled badly, weighed down by debt, management turnover, and increasingly fierce competition from Nike, a company that had not even existed when Rudolf first hung his sign above a converted building in 1948. By 1993, Puma was on the edge of real collapse, a shadow of the company that once paid Pelé to tie his shoes in front of 1 billion viewers. It took a new chief executive, Jochen Zeitz, brought in at just 30 years old, to turn the company around, repositioning Puma as a sleeker, more fashion-forward lifestyle brand throughout the late 1990s and the 2000s. It's a genuinely remarkable second act, and honestly, it's a story that could fill an entire video of its own. But it's worth remembering that none of that second act would have existed at all without the 14 employees Rudolf gathered in 1948, out of pure spite and pure necessity, in a building his brother wanted nothing to do with. Today, Puma is a multi-billion-dollar global company, selling shoes and apparel in more countries than Rudolf could probably have imagined from that small building on the south side of the Orphan. Adidas, the company his brother built out of the same ashes, remains its fiercest rival to this day, the two brands still facing off in stadiums and stores across the entire world, 70-plus years after two brothers stopped speaking to each other. Herzogenaurach itself still carries the scars of that feud. For decades, the town remained informally divided by allegiance. Adidas families on one side, Puma families on the other, right up until, remarkably, the two companies finally organized a joint charity soccer match between their employees in 2009, 35 years after Rudolf's death and 31 years after Adi's, as something of a symbolic peace offering between two workforces that had spent generations as rivals. You can actually trace a straight line from what Rudolf Dassler did with Pelé's shoelaces in 1970 to the entire modern industry of athlete endorsement that exists today. Every signature sneaker line, every 9-figure shoe contract for a rookie who has not played a single professional game yet, every carefully choreographed moment of an athlete showing off a logo in front of a camera, all of it descends in some way from a salesman's son from a small Bavarian town who understood, decades before anyone had a word for personal branding, that people don't just buy shoes, they buy stories, moments, and the feeling of being close to greatness. But Rudolf Dassler's real legacy is not really about the feud at all, even though that's the part most people remember first. It's about what a man can build after losing absolutely everything, including his family, his name's good standing, and the company he had spent 30 years of his life inside. He did not have his brother's hands for craftsmanship. What he had was a refusal to disappear. And that's how a boy raised over his mother's laundry basin and his father's shoe factory shifts, a man wrongly and rightly accused in the same breath, betrayed by blood and rebuilt by nothing but his own nerve, became the man behind the leaping cat that still chases his brother's 3 stripes into stadiums around the world today.